Well, let's get to our second conversation here and highlight some facts and figures around the 2023 proposed budget. While we consider the 2023 budget, experts have continued to fault the performance of the 2022 budget. They say the issue of debt service to revenue is one of the critical factors identified as being responsible for the poor performance of the 2022 budget. And for BudgIT, a civic-tech organization leading in advocacy for transparency and accountability, in Nigeria's public financial management and debt-to-service revenue ratio reached alarming levels within the first 4 months of 2022. Well, let's explore some of these facts. I have the CEO in the studio, Mr. Seun Onigbinde. He's the founder and CEO of BudgIT. Thank you so much. It's good to see you.
It's a pleasure.
It's been a while, yes. And we're coming at a time where the budget is here again. Yes. Our spending plan for 2023, well, proposed spending plan. First, many will say the timing makes real sense. The January to December budget cycle, that is a good one for plannings and all of that. But first, what is your take? 20.51 trillion naira. It's a shift from what we had last year, obviously. Do you think this is achievable?
It's a long shot, a very long shot, and it's a bit scary. And I know when we were having a transition year in 2015, which is when it was not certain, that a new government might come in, there was a bit of interest to dial down a bit on that budget and to ensure that you focus on the key things that are meant to be done. When a new government comes on board, they now figure out what needs to be done. It does not seem like the interest of the current administration. We have capital expenditure around 5.3 trillion. That is a huge size. We have things that we can't run away from, like the debt servicing cost, around 6.4 trillion naira. So we have not dialed down on what we should have done. We've just gone for big things. 20 trillion naira. Our revenue last 2 years was around less than 5 trillion naira. In 2022, maybe 5 trillion naira. That's what is looking with the current trend. Now, if we're doing a revenue of 5 trillion naira and we're planning to spend 20 trillion naira, where is the realism in that? And the danger that we have done recently is that we have not given room for any fiscal consolidation. The critical part of the budget that has been growing significantly has been the debt servicing cost. At the beginning of this administration, debt servicing cost was less than 2 trillion naira. Now, you have a debt servicing cost within a period of 7 years has moved around 6.4 projected trillion naira. There is a problem in there. And the government needs to ask itself hard questions. And that's why it was not surprising to us when the Minister of Finance spoke about maybe currency debt restructuring or debt refinancing, because the component of the budget that is spent on financing debt in the long term is unsustainable. If you look at the medium-term expenditure framework, which will project you for the next 2-3 years, we could reach up to 10 trillion naira in the next 2 years. So when you start those conversations, somebody has the question, there has to be a review of that environment. And if you know that your debt servicing cost is expanding, you have to check other places. Is it personnel cost you want to rationalize? Do you want to look at your overhead cost? Do you want to make your capex much more tighter and stop the fragmentation and the wasteful nature of it? All of that is not on the table. What we have done significantly is to borrow as much as possible and use the CBN to provide the support, and which part of the conversation is to securitize that, which we find very, very immoral and maybe even illegal. They will put it in that way.
Let's look at the assumptions now. I think crude oil price $70 per barrel, and production, including condensate, is about 1.69 million barrels per day. I think that is what we're working with. But I'm looking at, is this conservative enough if we are to look at these figures? Because that's where we're going to get little revenue from. Thanks, there's still crude oil theft on one other hand. That is also hampering that. But what do you make of the assumptions in totality?
On pricing at $70 per barrel, it seems conservative because it looks like the Russia-Ukraine war, even if it ends tomorrow, the after effects will not disappear. And I think the OPEC, they are holding a very long stick and they're playing a long game. And recently they cut 2 million barrels from global oil production within the members, and some other have joined them. So $70 is fine. Where I struggle with is the production. if you exclude condensate, which is around 300,000 to 400,000 barrels,
Yeah, so
we are shooting for somewhere around 1.3 million
1.3,
barrels.
1.2.
1.2. You're going to ask yourself, we even have an OPEC quota of around 1.74 million barrels per day, based on the recent cut. We're around 1.8 million, excluding condensate. That's because the OPEC quota does not include condensate. So why are we shooting that low? I mean, and that's my biggest challenge in here. We are in a time where oil prices are high. Every level of efficiency should be brought to the table to make sure that we're producing at maximum capacity. In fact, we don't have the luxury of abiding by the OPEC cuts. And 100,000 to 200,000 barrels per day is incredibly important for Nigeria, considering the current state of our fiscal balances. In Saudi Arabia, with huge reserves and huge production numbers for a small population, less than 40 million, says they want to produce that. They can. They can make cuts. We can afford to make cuts with 220 million people. So the questions have to be at the table. But we can't even make up 2 million. 1.1, we are doing 1 million barrels. So I think on the production level, we are not pushing ourselves hard on the production level. And I think that's, and it looks like we've given up. I mean, we've been seeing some progress from uncovering points where crude oil have been tapped and things like that. It sounds exciting, but the numbers shows that we're still not ambitious enough when it comes to the production level as much as possible.
Let's go back to the debt service, which we're going to do about 65% that's in the coming year. I'm also worried about the arguments that many will say, or that we've heard from maybe the likes of the Minister of Finance and other ministers, is that it depends on what you're borrowing for. Many will say the problem is really not borrowing, but what you're borrowing for. Let's take, for example, some will say rail development in Nigeria, some infrastructure development, one or two of them, are capital intensive, and government cannot fund some of this alone. So what do you make of borrowing, or what you borrowed, what it is used for, what is expended on? What do you make of that argument?
It's a good argument to have, to say you borrow for what you call self-liquidating assets. If I borrow for something, I must ensure that that asset is able to pay back itself.
Yes.
I borrow to be in a market store. That means I'm saying that monthly, yearly payment from the market store will pay back that. If I'm borrowing for infrastructure, I'm looking at the long-term impact of the infrastructure to pay back itself. But if you look at the numbers, you know that it doesn't add up. If we spend around 14 trillion naira, I think we do it in 2021. If we add revenue of around 4 trillion naira, we took almost 8 to 9 trillion as borrowing, or what you call deficit financing. The gap is too much, because even if you use debt servicing alone, what about salaries? Your debt service is around 4 trillion naira. Your revenue is around 4 trillion naira. So how are you paying salaries? So it's very, very clear that we have a significant revenue problem. We're borrowing to either refinance debt or service debt, or we're either borrowing to pay salaries. If at least we can carry our recurrent expenditure on the basis of our revenue, then it's fine. But even when we talk about capex, what capex? I mean, BudgIT has done significant analysis to show that a lot of projects in the budget are fragmented, they are wasteful, they are unnecessary. And you will see the trick of this by the time the budget comes back from the National Assembly. Significant projects will be imputed into the budget, micro projects. Imagine the federal government, solar lantern, 10 million, 15 million constituency. You have an 100 billion constituency project. That is not enough for the lawmakers. Now you now go into MDA's budgets and put all sorts of stuff inside it, and you call them capital projects. How does that make sense for planning? So those are the kind of reasons that the Nigerian budget, in our own view, has become a free-for-all. There is no fiscal discipline at the side of the executive to even tame the National Assembly from inserting items. The executive does not even have a control on its procurement space to say, these are the items that we will fund and these are the things that we will not fund. So when we have all that scenario on the table, we know that the budget is not delivering the impact that it was meant to be. The only way, and that's why this budget, we expected that we would do the basics. The basics is that we will have to do recurrent expenditure. We will say, because we're having elections. But less the new government have much more grip on the capex side of the budget.
It's also a budget of transition. You've gotten there now because, of course, we know President Buhari's administration it will finish his second tenure by next year. So obviously a new man becomes the CEO of Nigeria. Now, so how rich do you think this budget is for that transition? What I'm thinking is ongoing projects, just like the Buhari administration went on with completions and all of that. I think that should just be the way to go. Then another angle to that question is, I would ask that a country that has faced COVID-19, that has gone through a lot of issues, disruptions, and all of that, some analysts will justify these borrowings.
Yeah, I mean, people say that we have to apply
Two recessions.
the Keynesian model to put more money, and do more. But the reality is that it's a two-way street.
Okay.
You have to make government itself as efficient as possible in that environment. Then you now use whatever you can squeeze from those efficiencies is what you are putting in the hands of people. Because if you even look at it, even if we say that as that model worked effectively for us, and that's my big problem around the fact that we say we have to borrow to do what? To do social protection. We have to borrow to do salary. We don't want to cut salaries and things. It's fine, But the reality is that have we squeezed the efficiencies in government to be able to do those things? We have continued the way we have continued in robust big government. And that's why I look at the much more money we're pumping into the economy. We're not being able to tame inflation. We've not been able to have a hand on the exchange rates and the divergence between those markets. The fiscal side is not speaking to the monetary side. In fact, CBN is spending a whole lot on its own side than even what you might even imagine from the federal government during its development, economics, and other intervention programs.
What is the Bank of Industry and the Bank of Agriculture? What have they been doing?
Yeah.
All of this has been taken over by the CBN.
CBN. So it's significant that whoever is coming in 2023, because it's like a trite effort to push hard on this current government, I don't see that they have had a grip of the fiscal side of things. They've allowed CBN to dominate the space more than necessary. And CBN has its own intentions. It might be different from what it could be. But the new government has to have a leadership, especially at the finance ministry, that can dominate the fiscal policy that's meant to be. And the conversation on debt financing or debt servicing also has to be on the table. Conversations around the personnel cost sizing also have to be on the table. Then how efficient our capex efficiency, capital expenditure efficiency. If we're spending on projects, let there be projects that are federal government projects. Let the federal government stop hemorrhaging the things that should be done by local government at the state level. You see federal legislators tarring almost every road in their constituency. Is that the work of the federal government? Not necessary. You see everybody's inserted into the budget. The federal government should do what is not meant to. The federal government should focus on the big pipe project that small projects can fit into. So those are the kind of, when you hear the federal government doing the second Niger bridge, yes, those are the kind of things you should say do. And also there has to be a huge push on alternative financing. You have to give kudos to this government, be what they've done through the NSIA and different other agencies to create alternative infrastructure funding vehicles. But you have to double down on things like that, much more effective, and also keep sanity. I see that we're pushing hard on tax incentives for infrastructure development. MTN just recently got an approval to do, I think, the Enugu-Port Harcourt Expressway. It's good, but we still have a lot of efficiency that has to put in those things so that it doesn't just become free for all. But I'm happy that we are trying to find alternative infrastructure vehicle, because what we had prior to this government was not effective at all. As much as possible. But we can just do much more better with efficiency in capital expenditure.
I think the states also have a role to play in all of this. What do you think?
It's how the federal government incentivizes states. And I've always said is the only time you see the federal government stepping up for states is when they say we can't pay salaries.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that can't just be that can't be the only problem states have. And the only thing is that states have to be engines of productivity. There is no Nigerian without 36 states. Whatever we call Nigeria is a submission of 36 states. So if the engine of productivity say, state A, what are your capabilities? What are the capabilities you want to enhance? Let the federal government support you, back you effectively in making sure that those capacities are enhanced. If capacities, for example, cotton production, we'll back you up to be a cotton production point. But if the only time you see an intervention of the federal government, the CBN, is say we want to pay salaries, or something that seems discriminate and it's not tightened around some form of purpose, then you don't get the kind of results that we want. So that's one of the things. States can't continue to be federal government ad hoc support. There has to be long-term perpetual support to say, we want to see you grow this expertise. If it's a place like Lagos, you say, okay, it's going to be Nollywood, it's going to be music, it's going to be sports, and that's what we are partnering for Lagos to build a whole new industry around that. If it's a state like Oyo, you might say, okay, maybe agriculture, maybe it's in its northern belt. That's the kind of conversation you put to the table. But most times it looks like the only support for state is ad hoc, and there's not really well coordinated. Nigeria needs like long-term kind of thinking in leadership. And you have to anchor that around institutions, because if you put that within the political cycle, it's just 4 years, and before you know it, it's blown over. Yeah.
Very importantly, talking about now, when you look at the revenue, also expected revenue, you see the non-oil space doing pretty well, at least than what we used to do before. Your comments to that? Would you say that we are doing very well with regards to non-oil exports? I think we can do better.
I think we have not been ambitious enough on the FIR side. I mean, I feel like maybe Fowler had was over-ambitious. I don't think the current leadership of FIRS has been. If you look at the numbers in 2021, they met all their targets. I mean, in a time where you are trying to squeeze water from a stone, why are you trying to? We should get a much more stronger target. I think we could do far more better than this. I'm very, very clear about that. If the economic activities, the economy is improving, is growing, let FIRS do. I think maybe because we had COVID in 2020, there was an expectation that 2021 might not also have gotten that, we are not getting that tick. But I think FIRS should do much more stronger targets. For the only one that I think has excited me is independent revenue side. Much more can be done. But I think taking independent revenue in the previous, pre-2015 from around 400 billion, somewhere around 1.2, 1.6 trillion right now. It's good. It's a step forward in a way, significant. But there has to be much more. If you put everything to the table, the fact is that our revenue to GDP is less than 8%. And you would not even find that in a war-torn country, a country that's like even Afghanistan or even Syria. The money the federal government is taking, and it has including state and local government, you put all of that together, is too weak, which means that there's significant blind spots in the economy that we are not properly taxing. And the answer to all of this is that there has to be a deep interrogation on the tax architecture of this country. Who should collect personal income?
To GDP is about 6%.
And by the time you put in, because tax, by the time you put the whole revenue side to it, it's around 8%.
Wow.
So, and you see, and IMF says you should have at least 15% to be able to make significant progress. So for me, I feel the tax architecture itself should be on the table. VAT, PIT, CIT. Who gets what? Who's getting incentivized for what? Does the federal government need to get part of the personal income tax? Is it because we have fragmented the personal income tax that we are losing significant portion of all of this? A whole lot of things has to be on the table. That's why I hope the next government, because I don't know how much this current government can do, is able to get eggheads, people who can think on their feet and ask questions. There has to be hard work on revenue mobilization, and there has to be cross transparency, accountability, and efficiency on whatever you get.
That won't hit so much on the people when you talk about revenue generation.
You don't need to eat so much on the people, because there might be current leakages from what exactly people should be paying. Because if you have you have to look at the size of the workforce that you have, and you also have to incentivize formalization, because where do taxes get lost? If you have a huge informal system, then evidently it's going to be very difficult for you to take taxes off them. So you also have to incentivize formalization, that people who remain informal should come from. And it doesn't have to, even you could give them tax rebates or tax grants for 2 years. After 2 years of formalizing and getting your stability, start paying taxes. So there has to be a way to put a question on that. How do we incentivize formalization? And how do we look at where are the blinds? But like I said, because we've fragmented the petrol, everywhere, the corporates are not a chunk of tax payments. There is the personnel or the personal income tax that is always the chunk, either you like the UK budget or the US budget or South Africa. The payroll taxes are always the chunk of taxes. That's why For a country that wants to find progress, the biggest is how do you swell the middle class? Because you know that is the engine of growth and tax collection. But we have not even, we even now have a lot of the people in that space even are relocating, and we feel that it's an existential problem for us. So there has to be a way for us to put more jobs on the table, get more people into those middle class, because it's on the level of more formal jobs that we can get much more taxation.
Where do we go from here? Interesting conversation. The time is far spent already, but what is your outlook, particularly as we're looking at an election in 2023?
I'm happy. I mean, there's nobody that will talk about elections and won't talk about the economy.
Interestingly, this time around.
Security.
Business economy. Journalists, we have a lot to do this time.
But we need to interrogate that deeply, and we need to be honest. I was listening to the 14th Emir of Kano, Khalifa Sanusi Lamido. They said, Mohammed Sanusi, he says we need to be honest about the current situation of the country. If we're not honest, then we are going to be lying to ourselves. The outlook does not look exciting. But what we can do is that we will need an open-minded and a transparent leadership to tell us this is the situation. For example, we can no longer afford subsidy. When you look at the oil revenue, you see how small it is, despite even how poor the reproduction numbers are. It's because we have enriched that significantly from subsidy payments. So can we afford a 3 to 4 trillion naira subsidy? We can't.
No, we can't.
Can we continue to afford a disparate exchange rate where there's a window separate for some and another window for someone that is giving room to arbitrage and a crossing discipline? We can't. So we have to put some very difficult options on the table and be much more open. But being open means we have to build trust. If I see you walk by me with 60 cars, Prado Jeeps in your convoy, it doesn't elicit trust. You can't continue to live as it is normal, and you're asking me to take the squeeze. So those are the questions that have to be on the table.
Interesting conversation with Mr. Seun Onigbinde. There is founder and CEO of BudgIT, speaking to us about 2023 budget, of course, what it means, and some of the figures, facts and figures around this document. I must thank you so much. It's really good to see you and have you in the studio.
It's a whole pleasure. Thank you so much.
Hope to see you soon.
I wish to.
All right, there. Well.